He lived in a quiet town where most people knew each other by face, if not by name. His house sat at the edge of a long, dusty road that ended near a patch of trees and a narrow river that shimmered at sunset. Most evenings you could see him walking there with his dog, a strong Belgian Malinois with dark eyes and a steady stride. The man rarely spoke much to anyone, but those who saw him always noticed how calm he looked, how the dog walked right beside him without a leash, as if reading his thoughts. He had moved to this small town a few years earlier, hoping for peace and distance from the noise of his past life. People only knew that he was polite, private, and liked to keep to himself. The folks at the grocery store called him Sir, and the kids in the neighborhood waved when he jogged by in the mornings. He wasn't unfriendly. He just didn't seem to need company. His world revolved around simple routines: an early run, coffee on the porch, training sessions with his dog, and long hours spent fixing things around the house. The dog, named Shadow, was more than a pet. He was a partner, a friend, and sometimes it felt a guardian. Shadow never barked at strangers unless he sensed a real threat. He was trained to protect, but he also had a soft side that only the man truly saw. Every night Shadow would rest by his chair as he read or sat quietly by the window. They shared the kind of connection that didn't need words, just trust and time. The man had served for many years in a part of the military that most people didn't talk about openly. Those years had taken him to places far away from home, places filled with danger and decisions that changed lives in seconds. He had seen things that stayed with him, both the good and the bad. There were moments he remembered with pride and others he wished he could forget. When he finally retired, all he wanted was peace. But even peace could feel strange when you'd lived so long in chaos. Sometimes at night he would wake up suddenly, his heart racing, the memories pulling him back to old battlefields. In those moments, Shadow was always there, pressing close to his side, grounding him in the present. The dog never asked questions or demanded comfort. He just stayed close until the man's breathing slowed. That was all the comfort he needed. Shadow had once worked beside him overseas. They had gone through missions together, fast, silent, and precise. That bond had saved both of their lives more than once. In this quiet town, nobody knew about that past. To the locals, he was simply the quiet man with the well-trained dog. They saw him at the farmer's market or filling his truck at the gas station, always polite, always reserved. Some admired how disciplined the dog was. A few even asked him for training tips. He'd smile softly and say, "Just patience and time," then move along. He didn't talk about his old life. Not because he was ashamed of it, but because it didn't belong here. This town was where he wanted to start over. The mornings were his favorite part of the day. The air was still cool, and the roads were empty except for the hum of insects and the sound of his boots hitting the ground. Shadow trotted beside him, ears perked, matching his rhythm perfectly. After their run, he'd brew coffee, sit on the porch, and watch the sun rise over the trees. It was a simple routine, but it gave him a sense of order he had missed for years. Sometimes neighbors would stop by to chat. There was an older woman across the street who often brought him homemade pie, insisting he couldn't live on coffee alone. He'd thank her, offer a small smile, and send her home with vegetables from his garden. There were kids who liked to throw a ball near his yard just to see Shadow catch it midair. He let them play, but he always kept a watchful eye. He had learned long ago that peace was something fragile. You had to protect it, even in small ways. One Sunday afternoon, he took Shadow to the open field near the river. It was their favorite place to train and play. He'd whistle softly and Shadow would dart out, sprinting in wide circles, responding to hand signals and voice commands. The man moved with quiet precision, his posture still showing traces of military discipline. From a distance, it looked like a dance between human and animal, fluid, focused, wordless. A couple walking by stopped to watch, impressed by how obedient the dog was. The man nodded politely but didn't invite conversation. He preferred to keep his circle small. Despite his quiet ways, people in town respected him. They liked that he never caused trouble, and that his yard was always neat. He paid his bills on time, waved at the mailman, and helped fix a neighbor's fence once without being asked. Still, there was something about him that made people cautious. It wasn't fear, it was more like instinct. They could tell there was more to him than met the eye. He carried himself with a calmness that came from experience. And sometimes when his eyes drifted toward the horizon, they seemed to hold stories too heavy to tell. In the evenings, when the air cooled, he would sit outside with Shadow lying beside him. He'd listen to the sounds of the night, crickets, owls, the soft rustle of leaves, and let his mind wander. There was a part of him that still missed the adrenaline, the clear sense of purpose from his old missions. Civilian life was different. The world moved slower, and sometimes he struggled to find meaning in ordinary routines. But then he'd glance down at Shadow, breathing steadily, and remind himself that this was enough. Peace didn't have to be loud. Sometimes it was just the sound of your best friend snoring at your feet. Once in a while, a nightmare would wake him before dawn. In the dark, he'd sit at the edge of the bed, sweating and disoriented. He'd feel Shadow's head nudge against his arm, grounding him back to reality. Those moments reminded him of the bond they had built, not through words but through survival. Shadow wasn't just a companion. He was the one thread connecting the man's past and present. Without him, the quiet house would feel unbearably empty. The people who lived nearby saw only glimpses of his life. They didn't know how carefully he kept his emotions in check or how hard he worked to appear calm. When the local kids asked if they could pet Shadow, he'd always make sure the dog was relaxed first. He'd teach them how to approach gently, how to hold out a hand, how to let the dog decide if it wanted contact. He believed respect went both ways, between people and animals, between soldiers and civilians, between anyone trying to coexist peacefully. The man never talked about his service. He kept his medals in a small wooden box inside a drawer, along with a few photos of his old unit. Sometimes he'd take them out, look at them for a while, then put them back. Those memories were like old scars, important but not meant for display. The only one who ever saw him during those quiet moments was Shadow, sitting nearby, eyes steady and understanding. The dog didn't know the details, but somehow he seemed to sense the weight behind the silence. Most evenings ended the same way. The man would cook a simple meal, grilled meat, vegetables, maybe some rice, and share a small piece with Shadow. They'd eat quietly, the rhythm of normal life filling the house. Afterward, he'd check the locks, turn off the lights, and settle down to read or listen to soft music. It was a small, predictable routine, but it gave him a sense of control. After years of uncertainty, that control felt precious. Though life was peaceful, he sometimes felt like he was waiting for something, though he didn't know what. Maybe it was closure, maybe it was purpose. He had built walls around himself, not out of bitterness, but out of self-preservation. The world outside could be unpredictable, and he had seen enough of that. But within the small boundaries of his home, he had built something steady. Shadow was the center of it all, a loyal friend who needed no explanation. The seasons changed, but their rhythm stayed the same. They ran together through summer heat and winter frost, through rain and fog. Shadow loved the cold, dashing through puddles like a pup, while the man watched with quiet amusement. Sometimes he'd laugh softly, a sound that seemed almost new to him. Those were the moments that reminded him life could still be good, even simple. One afternoon, while repairing a loose fence post, he noticed Shadow staring down the road, ears up. A stranger's car had pulled over near the field, and a couple of kids had gotten out to play. Shadow didn't bark, but his body tensed, alert. The man gave a low command, and instantly the dog relaxed, sitting by his side. That obedience wasn't fear, it was trust. They had learned to move as one. People who saw it often said it was like the dog could read his mind. Maybe that was true. They had survived too much together for anything less. That night, as the sun dipped below the trees, the man sat on his porch and looked out at the quiet street. He could hear distant laughter, a car engine starting, a few dogs barking somewhere far away. Shadow lay beside him, resting his head on the man's boot. The sight made him smile faintly. For all the things he had lost, he still had this: peace, loyalty, and a friend who never judged him for his silence. He didn't know what the future would bring. He wasn't the kind of man to make big plans anymore. All he wanted was to live quietly, keep to his routine, and let the past stay buried where it belonged. The world had moved on, and he was content to let it. He didn't realize that soon, the peace he had built so carefully would be tested in a way he could never have imagined. But for now, under the fading light of a calm evening, it felt like the world had finally left him alone. The day started like any other. The air was cool, the kind of morning that made the town feel fresh and quiet. The man brewed his coffee, stood by the porch, and watched Shadow stretch before their walk. The dog's tail wagged slowly, eyes bright, ready for the daily routine. The world felt steady, peaceful, familiar. The same rhythm they had followed for years. He didn't know that by the end of that day, everything would change. It was late afternoon when it began. The sun was sliding low, casting long shadows across the narrow road. A few children were playing near the sidewalk, tossing a ball back and forth, their laughter carrying through the air. Shadow sat calmly in the yard, watching them with curiosity. The man had been fixing a small section of the fence that had loosened during a storm a few days earlier. He liked keeping things in order, keeping his home strong and neat. It gave him a quiet satisfaction. At one point, a delivery truck rolled by, its loud brakes hissing as it stopped at the next house. The noise startled one of the children's balls, which bounced hard against the fence and rolled into the man's yard. One of the kids hesitated, unsure whether to go get it. Shadow, alert but calm, stood up and watched. His ears perked, but his body stayed relaxed. The man waved to the child and said gently, "Go ahead, you can grab it. He won't hurt you." The kid nodded, grabbed the ball quickly, and ran back. Shadow didn't move, only tilting his head slightly. The moment passed without trouble. But someone watching from across the street misread what they saw. A woman sitting in her car had noticed the dog standing and the child running. From her angle, she thought the dog had lunged. Her heart jumped, fear clouding her view. Without thinking too much, she pulled out her phone and called 911. She told the dispatcher there was a large, aggressive dog in the street. It wasn't true, but by the time she realized her mistake, the call had already been made. Inside the house, the man had no idea any of this had happened. He went back to his repair work, humming quietly, while Shadow lay down beside him again. The neighborhood returned to its quiet rhythm. Birds chirped, cars passed, the sun kept sinking lower. Nothing seemed unusual. For him, it was just another day spent with his best friend. But a few minutes later, down the main road, 2 police officers received a call about a dangerous dog near a residential area. They had no reason to doubt it. They didn't know the caller or the man who lived there. They simply followed the report, thinking they were responding to keep people safe. The call was marked urgent, and they moved quickly. When their car turned into the neighborhood, the flashing lights reflected against windows and fences. People peeked out from their doors, wondering what was happening. The man heard the faint siren and looked up from his work. Puzzled, Shadow lifted his head too, ears twitching. The man frowned, sensing something strange. He wasn't used to seeing police cars on his street. The officers pulled up in front of his house, stepping out cautiously. They didn't draw their weapons, but their hands rested near their belts, a habit built from years of training. One of them called out, asking if everything was all right. The man straightened, wiping his hands on a rag, confused but calm. Shadow stood beside him, alert but quiet. "What's going on?" the man asked, his voice even. "We got a call about an aggressive dog," one officer said, scanning the yard. The man blinked, surprised. "Aggressive?" "He's not aggressive. He's trained." Before the conversation could settle, Shadow took a few steps forward, sensing the officer's tension. The movement was small, not threatening, but it made them uneasy. The man gave a quick hand signal for Shadow to stay, but to someone unfamiliar, it looked like a command for the dog to move closer. The officers misunderstood. "Sir, step back," one of them said sharply. The man frowned, holding out his hand. "It's all right. He's under control." But tension has a way of growing fast when fear is involved. The officers saw a large, muscular dog and a man giving unfamiliar hand gestures. They didn't see calmness or control, they saw risk. The dog took another cautious step forward, still silent, watching the strangers who carried an air of unease. The man started to speak again, but the situation was moving faster than his words. In that moment, Shadow barked once, a sharp, protective sound, meant as a warning, not aggression. But that single bark shattered the fragile calm. One of the officers, startled, reacted instinctively, moving his hand toward his side. The man stepped forward quickly, raising his voice. "Wait! He's—" But before he could finish, the sound that followed cut through everything. It happened so fast that even time seemed to stop. Then silence, the kind of silence that weighs heavy, like the air itself forgets how to move. Shadow fell to the ground, confusion in his eyes. The man froze, unable to believe what had just happened. He dropped to his knees beside his friend, his hands trembling. "No, no, no," he whispered, his voice breaking. The officers stood still, realizing too late that they had misunderstood everything. Neighbors began stepping out of their houses, drawn by the noise. A few people gasped when they saw the scene. The older woman from across the street covered her mouth, tears forming instantly. She knew the man, knew how much that dog meant to him. The children who had been playing earlier stood silently by the sidewalk, wide-eyed, holding their ball tightly. The man didn't yell. He didn't curse. He just held Shadow close, his face blank with shock. The officers tried to speak, but their words fell flat. One of them muttered something about calling for a vet, but everyone knew it was too late. The dog's breathing slowed, then stopped. The man placed a shaking hand on Shadow's head, his heart heavy with disbelief. For a long moment, nobody moved. The world felt frozen. Eventually, one officer took a hesitant step forward. "Sir, we didn't know," he said quietly. "We thought—" The man looked up slowly, his eyes filled with something that made the younger officer take a step back. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even hate. It was something deeper, heavier. The look of a man who had seen too much loss to find words for this kind. "You thought wrong," he said softly, almost whispering. Then he turned his gaze back to Shadow, brushing the dog's fur gently, his lips trembling. His silence said more than any words could. The officers radioed for their supervisor, voices low, uncertain. People gathered quietly at the edge of the street, whispering to each other, shocked and heartbroken. Some of them started defending the man immediately. They knew his dog. They had seen how gentle Shadow was. They knew this wasn't what it looked like. Within minutes, more cars arrived. A sergeant, animal control, and a few curious onlookers. The man stayed on the ground, still beside his dog. He refused to leave him there alone. Finally, when someone offered to take Shadow's body to the local vet, he nodded faintly. "I'll go with him," he said. The crowd parted as he stood up. He looked older in that moment, his shoulders heavy, his eyes hollow. The officers watched him walk away, guilt written all over their faces. None of them knew who he really was, what kind of man they had just wounded so deeply. At the vet's office, the man sat in silence. The staff there knew him too. They had seen him bring Shadow in for checkups and vaccinations, always gentle, always careful. When they realized what had happened, they didn't ask questions. They just gave him time. After the vet confirmed what he already knew, the man quietly asked for the dog's remains to be prepared so he could take them home. His voice was steady, but his eyes never left the small blanket on the table. That night, the town was unusually quiet. Word had already spread. Some blamed the police, others blamed the misunderstanding. Everyone agreed on one thing. It was a tragedy that shouldn't have happened. The man sat on his porch in the dark, the empty spot by his chair feeling like a hole in the world. He could still see Shadow's shape in his mind, could still hear the sound of paws against the porch steps. The silence felt unbearable. He didn't sleep that night. He sat awake, watching the stars fade into morning. The next day, officers returned to his house to apologize formally. They brought their supervisor, who spoke carefully, explaining the confusion, the mistaken report, the fear that had led to it all. The man listened quietly, his expression unreadable. When they finished, he said only one thing. "You can't undo what's done, but you can learn from it." Then he turned away, signaling the conversation was over. In the days that followed, people from town came by to check on him. The older woman brought food. The children left small drawings by his door, pictures of a man and a dog under the sun. He thanked them gently but kept mostly to himself. The house felt different now, too quiet, too still. Every sound reminded him of what was missing. Sometimes he'd sit outside, staring at the road where it happened, trying to understand how something so small, one call, 1 second of confusion, could take away something so precious. He didn't blame the woman who had called. He knew she hadn't meant harm. Fear makes people see danger where there is none, but he couldn't forget how it felt, how fragile peace suddenly became. He began walking the same route each morning again, but this time, he walked alone. At first, it felt unbearable. The road stretched longer, the silence heavier. But he kept going. He didn't want to forget the routine he and Shadow had shared. Each step was a memory, of loyalty, of trust, of love that didn't need words. The town watched him with quiet respect. They understood that something deep had shifted. What they didn't know was that beneath the calm exterior, there lived a man who had once faced the worst the world could offer, and survived. And yet, it was this, a single mistake, that had broken something inside him in a way nothing else ever had. He didn't tell anyone about his past. The uniforms, the missions, the medals. None of that mattered now. What mattered was that he had lost the one creature who had helped him believe in peace again, and though nobody knew it yet, the story wasn't over. The days that followed felt long and heavy. The man kept mostly to himself, staying inside his small house or sitting quietly on the porch where Shadow used to rest. The silence had a weight to it now. Even the sound of wind moving through the trees reminded him of footsteps that would never come again. He had lived through loss before, but this one hit differently. This was the kind of loss that didn't just hurt. It left an emptiness that seemed to echo through every hour. People in the neighborhood tried to help in their own ways. Some brought food. Others left cards or flowers by his gate. A few offered to sit with him, but he always thanked them politely and said he was fine. Deep down, he wasn't. He missed the sound of Shadow's paws, the feeling of companionship that had grounded him after years of uncertainty. Now even the smallest tasks felt strange without that steady presence by his side. A few days after the incident, someone from the local newspaper called. They wanted to talk about what had happened, the tragic misunderstanding, as they called it. The man didn't want to speak publicly, but he agreed to meet briefly, hoping to at least clear up the false idea that Shadow had been dangerous. He met the reporter at a small cafe in town, sitting by the window where the morning sun spilled across the table. The reporter was a young woman, polite and nervous, carrying a small notebook and a quiet sense of guilt for having to ask questions that reopened wounds. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said softly. "I just want to make sure the story reflects the truth." The man nodded. "The truth is simple," he said. "He wasn't a threat. He was my partner. That's all." She asked a few questions. How long he had owned the dog, how well trained he was, what happened that day. The man answered calmly, choosing his words carefully. He didn't blame anyone directly, but his tone carried something deeper, a quiet strength that came from years of facing things most people couldn't imagine. When the reporter looked up from her notes, she noticed something in his eyes that made her pause. "Were you in the military?" she asked softly. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, a long time ago. May I ask which branch?" He smiled faintly. "Let's just say I served in places most people never hear about." The reporter sensed there was more to him than he was saying, but she didn't press further. She thanked him, closed her notebook, and promised to write the story with care. As she left, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just spoken to someone whose story was far larger than one small-town tragedy. When the article came out, it spread quickly across the community. It described him as a decorated veteran, a quiet man who had served his country with honor and chosen to live a peaceful life afterward. The piece didn't go into detail about his past, but it mentioned that Shadow had once been a trained working dog, not just a pet. The story was written with empathy, and it struck a chord with people. Readers began to ask questions. Who was this man really, and what kind of service had he given? Within a few days, old friends and former colleagues began reaching out. Some had seen the article online and recognized the details. A few phone calls were made, messages passed along through networks of retired soldiers. One evening, the man received a quiet knock on his door. When he opened it, he saw a tall figure standing there, an old teammate from years ago. The man's hair was gray now, but his posture still carried the discipline of a soldier. "I heard what happened," the visitor said. "Didn't seem right not to come." They sat together on the porch for a long time, not saying much. Sometimes words weren't necessary between people who had shared what they had shared. The visitor looked out toward the trees, then said, "You always were the calm one, even when everything went wrong." The man gave a small smile. "Didn't help much this time," his friend sighed. "I read the report. People don't know who you are. If they did, they'd understand. You were the one who kept us all alive more than once." The man shook his head. "That was a long time ago. Doesn't matter now," but his friend didn't agree. Before he left, he said, "Maybe it's time people see the whole picture." The next week, more details began to surface. The newspaper ran a follow-up story after speaking with some of his former teammates. They didn't reveal classified information, of course, but they confirmed that the quiet man living on the edge of town had once been part of one of the most elite military units in the country. He had served with distinction, leading missions that had saved countless lives. The article described him as one of the most skilled and disciplined operators in Delta Force history. The story spread beyond the small town. Larger news outlets picked it up, calling him The silent hero whose peace was shattered by a mistake. People online shared their sympathy, their outrage, their admiration. Veterans groups reached out, offering support. Messages poured in from strangers who thanked him for his service and expressed sorrow for his loss. For a man who had lived quietly for years, the sudden attention felt overwhelming. He didn't want the spotlight. He didn't want praise or pity. All he wanted was the quiet life he had built, the one that had been taken from him so suddenly. But he understood that the truth had a way of finding light, even when you tried to hide it. One afternoon, as he sat outside, a few of the officers involved came to visit again. This time their faces looked different, not just guilty but deeply humbled. They had read the articles. They knew now who he was, what kind of man they had faced that day. One of them, the younger one, spoke first. "Sir," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "We didn't know. We didn't know who you were. If we had," the man raised a hand gently, stopping him. "It wouldn't have changed anything," he said. "You don't treat people differently because of who they are. You treat them right because it's the right thing to do." The officer nodded, eyes wet. "I'm sorry. I can't say anything that makes it better, but I am truly sorry." The man looked at him for a moment, then spoke quietly. "I believe you. Just make sure it never happens to someone else." That simple exchange stayed with the officers for a long time. It changed how they approached their work. They began attending extra training on communication and animal behavior. They met with community leaders to discuss how to prevent similar situations in the future. The tragedy had become a turning point, not just for the man, but for the town itself. As weeks passed, the man began to feel the smallest traces of healing. It wasn't quick or easy. Some days the pain felt fresh all over again, but he noticed that people treated him differently now, not out of fear or pity, but respect. They greeted him warmly when they saw him in town. The children still waved, though more quietly now, as if sensing the weight of what had happened. The older woman across the street often brought food without saying much, just setting it down on his porch with a small smile. Sometimes he received letters from strangers, people from other states, even other countries. Many of them were from veterans who said they understood the bond between a soldier and his dog. Some wrote about their own losses, their own attempts to find peace after years of service. Reading those letters reminded him that he wasn't alone. Others carried similar stories even if they never met. One evening he sat on his porch with a small stack of those letters beside him. The air smelled of rain and the sky was painted with soft shades of orange and gray. He read one letter from a woman whose husband had served in a different unit overseas. She wrote, "He always said that when you lose someone you fought beside, even if that someone has 4 legs, it takes a piece of your heart with it. But it also reminds you that love in any form is worth the pain." The man folded the letter carefully and stared out at the yard. He thought about all the missions, all the faces, all the moments that had shaped him. He realized that, in a way, Shadow had been his last connection to that life, the final chapter of a story that began long ago. Losing him hurt deeply, but it also made him remember something important. Peace isn't the absence of pain. It's learning how to live with it and still move forward. He began to spend more time outside again. He started walking the trails near the river, the same ones he and Shadow had loved. The first few times were hard, but eventually he found comfort in the quiet sounds of nature. One day, a small stray dog began following him on his walks. At first, he ignored it, not ready to open that part of his heart again. But the dog kept showing up, shy, thin, with cautious eyes that reminded him of trust not yet earned. After a week, he began leaving food out. Slowly, the little dog grew braver. It would wag its tail from a distance, then creep closer each day. One morning, the man knelt down and held out his hand. The dog hesitated, then took a step forward. It wasn't Shadow, and it never would be, but something about the moment felt right. Healing doesn't come all at once, like it comes in small, quiet moments like that one. Back in town, people noticed the change. He started smiling more, greeting neighbors again, offering a hand when someone needed help. He even volunteered at the local community center once a week, teaching a short class on discipline, patience, and teamwork. Lessons drawn from his years of experience. Though he never spoke about the specifics, he used those classes to teach young people how to stay calm in stressful moments, how to think clearly before reacting, how to choose restraint over fear. Through that quiet work, the man began to build something new, not just for himself but for others. The loss that had once torn his world apart slowly began to become a source of purpose. The story that had started with tragedy was turning into something that could teach compassion and understanding. At night, he still thought about Shadow. Sometimes he dreamed of walking together again, the same trail by the river, the same calm air. But when he woke, instead of sadness, there was a gentle peace. He would look out at the sunrise and whisper, "We did good, didn't we?" And deep down, he knew the answer. Weeks turned into months, and the man's life began to settle again, though it would never be quite the same. The world around him kept moving forward. The seasons shifted, children grew taller, neighbors came and went. But for him, every day still carried a quiet ache. He had learned to live with the pain not by forgetting, but by finding purpose in small, simple things. After the story of his past became public, people began looking at him differently. It wasn't the kind of attention he liked. He wasn't proud of being seen as a hero, and he didn't enjoy people whispering about his history. What mattered to him wasn't recognition, it was what came after. And what came after was a chance to help others understand the cost of misunderstanding and fear. One morning, he received an unexpected visit from the town's police chief. The chief was an older man, respectful and steady, who had heard about everything that had happened and wanted to make things right. He arrived without a uniform, wearing a plain shirt and a tired expression that showed he had been thinking about this meeting for a while. The man opened his door, quiet as always. The chief nodded politely. "Thank you for seeing me," he said. "I just wanted to talk, no formal business, just a conversation." The man gestured for him to sit on the porch. They sat there in silence for a moment, the sound of birds filling the space between them. Finally, the chief spoke. "What happened that day? It's something we'll never forget. It was wrong, and I know words can't fix it, but I want to do better. I want our department to do better." The man didn't respond right away. He looked out at the trees, remembering how peaceful this view had once felt. "I believe you," he said finally. "The question is how?" The chief nodded slowly. "That's why I came. I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to help us, maybe guide some of our officers, teach them how to handle tense moments with calmness instead of fear." The man thought about it for a long time. The idea made sense, but it also stirred emotions he wasn't sure he was ready to face. He had spent years avoiding reminders of his old life, the drills, the commands, the responsibility. But deep down he knew this wasn't about reliving the past. It was about preventing others from repeating the same mistake. He finally said, "If it means no one else goes through what I did, then yes, I'll help." And so it began. A few weeks later, he found himself standing in front of a small group of officers in a community center meeting room. The atmosphere was quiet, respectful. Most of them had heard his story. Some had even been there that day. He didn't use notes or slides. He just spoke from experience, his voice steady, his words simple. "Fear is natural," he began. "Everyone feels it. But what you do with it, that's what matters. In my world, fear wasn't something we ran from. We learned to see through it, to act with clarity even when everything around us was falling apart." He paused, looking around the room. "You're not soldiers. You don't have to be. But you do carry responsibility when to stay calm, to read a situation clearly, and to remember that hesitation or misunderstanding can change someone's life forever." He didn't raise his voice or try to sound inspiring. He just told the truth. The officers listened closely, not out of obligation but out of genuine respect. They could feel that his words came from experience, not theory. After the session, several of them came up to shake his hand. One young officer said, "I'll never forget this, sir." "Thank you." The man nodded, offering a small smile. "Don't thank me," he said. "Just remember." Over time, these training sessions grew. The police department began inviting him regularly to speak to new recruits. He showed them simple techniques: how to control breathing during stress, how to observe details instead of reacting to assumptions, how to keep a clear mind under pressure. He also taught them how to communicate calmly with the public, how to diffuse tension before it grew. The work was quiet but meaningful. He began to feel that he was finally using his pain for something good. Outside those sessions, his life remained simple. He still spent his mornings walking near the river, sometimes with the small stray dog that had started following him months earlier. He had never officially adopted it, But it came every day, wagging its tail and trotting beside him as if it had always belonged there. He called it Scout. It wasn't a replacement for Shadow, nothing could be. But it was a reminder that love could find you again. Even when you weren't looking for it, people in town noticed how much calmer the police seemed lately. There were fewer reports of tension, fewer misunderstandings. The chief often credited the change to the man's quiet guidance. Word spread to nearby towns, and soon, other departments began inviting him to share his perspective. At first he refused, and he didn't like attention, but the chief persuaded him gently, saying, "It's not about fame. It's about impact." He agreed, and before long he was speaking in different places, always the same way. Soft voice, steady tone, no ego. He wasn't a motivational speaker. He was a teacher of calmness, of control, of compassion. People respected him because he didn't preach. He simply shared what he had learned the hard way. One evening after a session, a young officer approached him. She looked nervous but determined. "Sir," she said, "I joined this job because I wanted to protect people, but sometimes it's hard not to react when things happen fast. You make it sound so easy, even staying calm, thinking clearly. How do you actually do that?" The man thought for a moment, then replied, "It's not easy. You just practice until calm becomes your habit. You train your mind the same way you train your body. Repetition, patience, and self-awareness. The goal isn't to feel nothing. It's to feel everything and still act with discipline." The young officer nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. That was the kind of wisdom people carried with them long after the conversation ended. Back home, life continued quietly. Scout followed him everywhere now, curling up at his feet when he read or sleeping beside the porch at night. Sometimes he would catch himself smiling again, real smiles, the kind that came naturally. He often spoke softly to Scout, as if talking to Shadow through him. "You came at the right time," he'd say, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Guess I needed you more than I realized." One day a letter arrived in the mail. It was from the officer who had fired the shot that day months ago. The handwriting was shaky but careful. The letter was long, filled with apology and remorse. The officer wrote that he had joined therapy, was working on his instincts, and had started volunteering with a local animal rescue center in honor of Shadow. He ended the letter with, "You taught me more about control and humanity than any training ever could. I'm trying to become the kind of person who would have seen clearly that day." The man read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer with the others. Letters from veterans, strangers, and now, from the man who had once made the worst mistake of his life. He didn't feel anger anymore, only understanding. People change when they learn, and this was proof that even pain could lead to growth. The following month, the town invited him to speak at a community event. He almost said no, he didn't like crowds, but he decided to go. The theme of the event was healing through understanding. When he walked onto the small stage, the crowd stood and applauded. He looked uncomfortable at first, but smiled politely. When he spoke, he didn't mention the tragedy directly. Instead, he talked about connection, between people, between past and present, between mistakes and forgiveness. "We all carry things," he said. "Some carry fear, some carry guilt, and some carry loss. But we can't let those things build walls between us. The only way forward is through patience, empathy, and the willingness to see others as more than a moment's mistake." The crowd was silent as he finished. There was something powerful in his simplicity. No dramatic speeches, no big emotions, just truth spoken from experience. Afterward, people lined up to shake his hand. Many thanked him for his honesty. A few even said his words had changed how they looked at life. When he went home that night, the moonlight spilled across his porch, and Scout was waiting at the door, tail wagging. He sat down beside the dog, looking up at the stars. The quiet didn't feel as heavy anymore.